The last $10 I owned in this world bought me a hole in the ground that no one had wanted for 50 years. I want you to hold that sentence for a moment. Not the poverty of it, though. The poverty was real enough. Not the desperation, though I had known desperation by then in ways I would not have believed possible 2 years before. I want you to hold the particular quality of that morning. The quality of a woman who has made a decision that cannot be unmade, who has walked through a door she cannot walk back through and who is standing on the other side of it, wondering with a stillness that is almost calm what she has done. The land office in Greystone smelled of stale paper and cold dust. It was the smell of transactions, of things reduced to numbers and signatures, of lives converted into columns in a ledger. Through the single window, the first hard frost of November 1888 had laid a brittle silver glaze across the boardwalk planks, and the peaks to the north were already lost inside a bank of iron-colored cloud. The kind of cloud that did not pass, the kind that settled in for the season. I had walked 3 miles to get there. My boots were thin at the soles, and I could feel the cold of the road through the leather. With each step a persistent reminder of the distance between where I was and where I had once believed I would be at 63 years old. I had believed the way women of my generation were encouraged to believe that the later years would be a kind of harvest, that the hard work of the earlier decades would translate by some reliable arithmetic into security, into warmth, into a place at a table that was yours and could not be taken from you. Robert had believed it too. He had believed in many things with a quiet, scholarly certainty that I had loved about him and that the world had not rewarded. He believed in the deep logic of the earth, in the honesty of stone, in the idea that the land held its history in ways that human records could not falsify. He spent his working life reading that history, layer by layer, vein by vein. He was not a wealthy man. He was not a practical man in the ways the town of Greystone defined practical. But he had been mine, and for 26 years that had been enough. The fever took him in 3 days. That is the fact of it. 3 days in April of 1886, and the man who had taught me to read the language of limestone and granite and shale was gone. And I was left standing in the small rented farmhouse we had shared for 11 years with my 70-year-old mother, Ida, whose hands were twisted with arthritis and whose lungs had been fragile since the winter of 1879, and with our dog, Cinder, a gray-muzzled shepherd, who had been Robert's companion on 100 hillside surveys, and who now moved through the house looking for him in every room. The new owner of the farm came in that first summer, a stern man with 3 grown sons who needed land they could work. Not a widow who spent her afternoons tapping rock outcroppings with a small geological hammer. He was not cruel about it. He gave us 30 days, which was more than he was required to give. And he said so, which reduced whatever gratitude I might have felt to something considerably smaller. 30 days. I had gone to the town council. I had presented our situation with the clarity and composure I had learned from 26 years of accompanying a man who presented his findings to skeptical audiences. The council listened. They deliberated. They arrived at a solution with the grim efficiency of men who have resolved such problems before and expect to resolve them again. There was a room available at the widow's home run by the church, they said, for Ida. And there was work available at the poorhouse laundry, they said, for me. I could take my meals there. I would have a cot. They would be separated, these 2 words. I turned them over in my mind as the council spoke, looking at my mother across the room, at her small upright figure, at the way her knotted hands rested in her lap, with a dignity that asked nothing from anyone. Ida had raised me alone after my father died of a logging injury when I was 4 years old. She had worked her hands to their current condition so that I could have shoes and schooling. She was 70 years old and her lungs rattled in cold weather. and she needed someone who knew the sound of her breathing to be near her at night. I told the council no. The word was quiet, and it was absolute. And the silence that followed it in that room was the silence of men recalibrating, deciding which category to place me in. Not the grateful widow, not the manageable problem, something else. I spent the following 2 years in a room we rented in the house of a woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who was not unkind but who needed the rent money on the first of each month with a precision that allowed no exceptions. I paid it by mending. Shirt collars, dress seams, the hems of children's coats. Work that the women of Greystone brought to my door without quite meeting my eyes. Because it is uncomfortable to look directly at a woman whose circumstances remind you how thin the floor is beneath your own feet. I saved what I could. By November of 1888, I had $10 in a small leather purse. Each coin earned one careful stitch at a time. And I had also developed a cough of my own from bending over fine work in poor light. And Ida's lungs had worsened with the damp of the lower room. And Mrs. Pruitt had informed me with genuine regret that she needed our room for a cousin arriving from the East. We had 2 weeks. It was Reverend Hatch who clarified for me with the accidental precision of a man who believes he is offering comfort what my options were. He came to call on a Tuesday afternoon sitting across from me in Mrs. Pruitt's small parlor, with his hat on his knee, and his expression arranged into the shape of pastoral concern. A woman's domain, he said, quoting himself from a sermon I had sat through 6 months earlier, was the hearth and not the hillside. He said this as though it explained something, as though it resolved something. He said that there was still the room at the widow's home for Ida, and still the work at the laundry for me. He said that a mind filled with stones had no room for the Lord. I thanked him for coming. I showed him to the door. I stood at the window and watched him walk back toward the church, and I felt with a clarity I had not expected that the conversation had been useful. Not in the way he had intended, but useful. The next morning I went to the land office. Silas Webb was a man whose softness was concentrated in his belly and absent from his eyes. He sat behind his desk with the settled authority of a man who had occupied that particular chair for many years and intended to occupy it for many more. And he looked at the leather purse I set on his desk with an expression that contained, if I had to name it, a species of pity that had long since curdled into something closer to contempt. He did not count the coins. He knew what was there. He pulled a map from his drawer, a county survey of unwanted parcels, and he spread it on the desk between us with the air of a man performing a kindness he does not particularly feel. There was swampland 20 miles to the south, he said, a sheer cliff face to the north. And then there was the plot just outside of town. His finger came down on a spot on the map, and I looked at where it rested. A hillside of scrub pine and loose shale just under 2 miles from the edge of Greystone. 50 acres of limestone country that had been on the county's books since 1838, because no one had found a use for it. At its center, a collapsed cave that the local children called Devil's Moor, and dared each other to enter on full moon nights. He pushed the deed across the polished wood. His finger tapped the paper once. $10 for the Devil's Moor widow, he said. The words precisely spaced, precisely weighted. May it keep you and your mother as warm as your husband's memory. I picked up the deed. The paper was cool against my fingers. I did not flinch, and I did not respond because there was nothing to say to a man like Silas Webb that would penetrate the comfortable armor of his certainty. And I had learned in 63 years to preserve my energy for work that had some prospect of return. I walked home with the deed in my coat pocket and the empty purse in my hand, and I thought about Robert. I had known Robert Hale for 29 years and been married to him for 26 of them, and in all that time the thing, that had most distinguished him from other men was not his intelligence, though he was intelligent, and not his kindness, though he was kind. It was the quality of his attention. He paid attention to things that other people had decided were not worth paying attention to. He would spend an afternoon with a piece of limestone the size of his palm, turning it in the light. And when he finally set it down, he would know something about it that no one else in the county knew. And he would know it with the quiet certainty of a man who has done the necessary work. He had paid that quality of attention to this hillside, to Devil's Moor. He had surveyed the entire limestone belt north of Greystone over the course of 4 summers, working on weekends and during the slow months when his consulting work was thin. He carried his equipment up the shale slopes and down into the gullies, and he came home in the evenings with mud on his boots and notebooks filled with observations that no one in Greystone had asked for and no one would pay for. I had asked him once in the early years whether it troubled him that his most careful work produced nothing the world recognized as valuable. He had thought about this for a moment. Then he said that the work was not for the world as it currently stood. It was for whatever came next. I had not fully understood what he meant until the night after his burial, when I went through his desk and found the Bible he had set aside for me. It was not his reading Bible. It was a spare one purchased separately, and when I opened it to the place marked with a slip of paper, I found folded between the pages of Lamentations and Ezekiel a piece of tanned rabbit skin on which he had drawn a map. It was the most detailed thing he had ever made, more detailed than any of the survey documents in his filing boxes, more careful than the geological cross-sections he had submitted to the university correspondence he maintained with professors in Philadelphia. It showed the limestone country north of Greystone in a level of particularity that could only have been produced by years of systematic observation. And at its center, marked with a notation in his small, precise handwriting, was the collapsed cave on the hillside that no one had wanted for 50 years. Beside the notation, he had written 2 lines. The first was a sentence from his own observations passage northwest behind the fall. Follow the warm current. The second was a quotation from a man named Trevithick. Robert had told me about Trevithick once in the early years of our marriage, when we were still in the habit of talking late into the evenings about the texture of his working days. Trevithick had been a Cornish miner, a man who had come to Pennsylvania from the tin country of England with his family in 1848, and had spent 30 years working and supervising mines of various kinds across the mid-Atlantic states. Robert had employed him for one summer in 1868, when he was conducting a survey of an abandoned iron mine in Cumberland County. And in that summer, Trevithick had taught him more about what lay beneath the surface of the earth than all of his university training combined. The specific lesson Robert remembered most clearly, the one he returned to in conversation, was the afternoon Trevithick had taken him down into an old working that had been sealed for 20 years and shown him how to listen to the rock. Not metaphorically, literally. You put your hand flat against the stone, and you felt for the temperature differential, and you listened for the change in resonance between sections that were solid and cold, and sections that were connected through fissures and passages too small to see to something below. Stone that breathes warm, Trevithick had said, remembers the earth's first fire. Find that breath and you will never freeze. Robert had written this sentence on the rabbit skin map beside his notation about the Northwest Passage. He had underlined it once. I had read it the night after his burial, sitting at his desk in the lamplight with Cinder's head in my lap, and I had not known what to do with it. And so I had placed the map back in the Bible and put the Bible in the bottom of my traveling trunk, and I had gone about the business of surviving. I took it out again the night I returned from the land office with the deed to Devil's Moor in my coat pocket. We left Mrs. Pruitt's house on a Friday morning in the second week of November. Ida moved with the deliberate economy of a woman who has learned to carry herself carefully, each step placed with the attention that her unreliable lungs demanded of her. She did not complain. Ida had never in her life complained about a physical difficulty which was either a great strength or a problem, depending on whether you were trying to assess her actual condition. Cinder walked between us, his gray muzzle close to the ground, reading the road with his nose in the way that old dogs continue to do, long after the intelligence required to process the information has begun to dim. I had a handcart with our belongings, 2 trunks of clothes and linens, Robert's geological tools which I had kept, his notebooks, all 14 of them, and his reference texts. 3 months of preserved food that I had been accumulating carefully for the past 6 weeks, spending nothing on anything that was not essential. 50 pounds of potatoes a sack each, of dried beans and oats, onions, carrots, dried meat, purchased from the butcher at the end-of-week discount. When he was clearing his inventory, 2 blankets in addition to the ones we already owned, a supply of tallow candles, a length of heavy canvas. I had calculated the quantities with the same care Robert applied to his surveys. I knew what 2 women and a dog required to sustain themselves through a winter, and I had purchased exactly that with a margin of 10% for error, and I had spent 31 of the dollars I had accumulated over the previous 2 years in doing so, which was why only 10 remained for the deed. The 2 miles to the cave took most of the morning. The handcart was heavy and the road became a track, and then the track became nothing. Just the hillside rising through the scrub pine toward the limestone outcroppings above. I had studied the map carefully enough that I knew where I was going, but knowing and arriving are different things, and by the time we reached the mouth of the cave I was breathing hard, and Ida was holding onto my arm with both hands, and Cinder had sat down in the pine needles and was looking at me with an expression that I could only describe as concerned. The cave entrance was wider than I had expected and lower, a dark horizontal gap in the limestone face, partially obscured by a fall of rock that must have come down sometime in the past decade. The air coming out of it was cold and carried the smell of damp stone and old earth. I stood at the entrance for a moment, looking in holding the lantern I had lit before we left the road, and I felt the specific quality of doubt that arrives not at the beginning of a decision, but in the moment when the decision makes contact with reality. Then Cinder walked past me into the dark, his nails clicking on the limestone floor, and disappeared around the first bend, and I heard his footsteps moving away and then stopping, and then I heard him settle down. The soft thump of an old dog lying down on stone, and I picked up the handcart handles and followed him in. The first week was a lesson in the specific physics of cold. Cold in an open field is uncomfortable. Cold in a damp limestone cave is something else entirely. It is not a temperature so much as a presence, a weight that settles into the joints and remains there, that soaks through wool and blankets, and the warmth of another body pressed against yours, and finds the places where the heat is thinnest and works at them with a patience that does not sleep. The walls of the cave exhaled it continuously. The floor conducted it upward through the pine bough bedding I had laid down as insulation. The air carried it in every breath. Ida's cough, which had been manageable in Mrs. Pruitt's house, became in the cave a constant low percussion. Each bark echoed off the limestone walls and came back changed, enlarged, more alarming than the original. I lay awake through the first nights, listening to the quality of each breath, running the arithmetic of what I was hearing against what I knew about her lungs, trying to determine whether what I was listening to was the sound of endurance or the sound of something worse. My own hands lost their dexterity in the cold. Striking a match required concentration and multiple attempts. The simple act of tying a knot in the lantern wick became a problem to be solved rather than a thing to be done. When I went to the creek below the hillside to fill our water pail, dizziness would sometimes take me without warning, the world tilting sideways, and I would have to crouch in the frozen mud with my hand on the ground until it passed. We ate carefully. Oats in the morning heated over the small fire I built near the cave entrance, where the smoke could find its way out. A potato and a piece of dried meat in the evening. The hunger that remained after these meals was not dramatic. It was a low, persistent fact, a dull weight beneath the ribs that was simply always there, like the cold, like the dark, like the sound of Ida's breathing. On the fifth night, the temperature dropped sharply, and the wind came down from the peaks and found the cave entrance and moved through the outer chamber with a sound that was not quite a howl and not quite a moan, but something between the two. Something that the dark and the cold converted into a sound that had intent behind it. Ida was feverish, her face dry and bright, her eyes moving under closed lids. Cinder lay against my back and trembled with a fine, continuous vibration that I could feel through my spine. I lay in the dark, and I thought about the poor house laundry. I thought about the steam of it, the reliable warmth. I thought about Reverend Hatch's face arranging itself into the shape of "I told you so." I thought about what it would cost me to walk back into town and knock on the council's door and accept what they had offered. And I found, going through the calculation carefully, that I could not determine whether what was stopping me was genuine judgment or merely pride. And I was not at all certain in that particular dark that pride was a sufficient reason. The body makes its own decisions sometimes before the mind has finished deliberating. I became aware somewhere in the middle of that fifth night that my shivering had changed quality. It was no longer the helpless vibration of a body losing its heat. It was something more deliberate, more purposeful. The body fighting. The body refusing to concede the argument. And somewhere alongside that awareness came the word from Robert's notebook. Not the full sentence, just the single word. Breathes. Limestone breathes. It is porous. It holds the memory of water and air. The dampness. That was the problem, not the cold alone. Cold was manageable. Wet cold was something else. Wet cold was the thing that killed. I lay still and thought about this with the focused attention of a woman who has no margin for error. If the cave breathed as Robert had said, as his geology texts had confirmed, then somewhere within it there was air moving. Air moving meant differential pressure. Differential pressure in limestone country meant passages. And passages in the northwest direction, as the map indicated, might mean something warmer, might mean exactly what Trevithick had described to Robert on an afternoon in Cumberland County 20 years before. Stone that breathes warm. The earth's first fire finding its way to the surface through the only paths available to it. I did not sleep again that night. I lay still to preserve my warmth. And I thought about the map. I had memorized it in the way that I had memorized useful things throughout my life. Not by rote repetition, but by understanding, by tracing the logic of it until the logic became part of me. The northwest passage behind the fall, the warm current, the notation made by a man who had surveyed every inch of this hillside and then folded his findings into a Bible and left them for a woman he trusted to know what to do with them. In the morning, I left Cinder with Ida pressed against her side for warmth, and I took the lantern and went deeper. The outer chamber of the cave was large, larger than our small fire, and single lantern had revealed in the first days. The ceiling rose in some places to twice my height, and in others descended until I had to bend to pass beneath. The floor was uneven limestone rubble and old flowstone, and in the lantern light the walls showed the striations of different geological periods laid one upon another. the record of time written in stone. The way Robert had always said, it was patient and legible to those who knew how to read it. The northwest wall. I went to it and moved along it slowly, holding the lantern close to the surface, looking for what Robert's map described as the fall. I found it after 20 minutes, a section of the wall where the ceiling had come down, at some point, perhaps recently, perhaps decades ago, leaving a mound of broken limestone that partially blocked what lay behind it. Behind it, in the gap between the fallen stone and the living wall, there was a darkness that was different from the darkness elsewhere in the cave. A darkness with depth to it. A passage. It took me a quarter of an hour to clear enough of the fall to get through. The pieces of limestone were heavy, and my hands were clumsy with cold. And twice I knocked the lantern with my elbow, and had to stop and steady my breathing before continuing. But the opening widened with each piece I moved, and with each piece I moved, I felt it more clearly. A differentiation in the air against my face, a change in the quality of what was reaching me from the passage beyond. Warmer, drier. I went through on my hands and knees, pushing the lantern ahead of me, and I stood up on the other side in a passage that was narrow but tall enough to stand in. And I stood still for a moment with my eyes closed and felt what the air was doing. It was moving. A slow, continuous exhalation from somewhere ahead, steady and gentle as a sleeping breath. And it was warm. Not warm the way a heated room is warm. Warm the way the earth is warm when you dig below the frost line in January and put your hand into the soil that has not forgotten summer. A warmth that was not produced by anything burning, not maintained by anything human, but simply present, rising from below through the ancient channels that limestone makes over centuries of patient dissolution. I followed the passage for what I later calculated was approximately a quarter of a mile, moving slowly, holding the lantern to the walls and watching the calcite formations catch the light and hold it and release it in small, glittering increments. The passage turned twice and descended in a gradual slope, and then widened into a space that was not quite a room and not quite a continuation of the passage, but something between the two. A long chamber with a ceiling that curved overhead in the shape of a wave, caught mid-motion, and along the far wall running the full length of the chamber, in a diagonal crack that the lantern light threw into dramatic relief the fissure. I stood at the edge of it and held my hand above it and felt the breath of it against my palm. The rock surrounding the fissure was warm to the touch. Not uncomfortably warm, but warm in the way of stone that has absorbed heat from below over a very long time. I pressed my palm flat against the limestone and held it there. And what I felt was the particular quality of warmth that does not come from the sun or from fire, but from something older and more constant. The heat of the planet itself finding its way upward through the only paths the rock allowed. It was not a miracle. I want to be clear about that because I'm a woman who was married to a geologist, and I have never in my life confused what the earth does with what God does, though. I believe both are real. What I was standing in was a geothermal feature, a place where the residual heat of the planet's interior conducted upward through the limestone in a rate sufficient to maintain a temperature differential that was, as I stood there, calculating significant. It was as Trevithick had told Robert on an afternoon in Cumberland County in 1868, the Earth's first fire. It had been here for longer than anyone could imagine. It would be here after every person currently living in Greystone was gone. It asked nothing of me and offered me everything. I set the lantern down on the cave floor. I pressed both palms flat against the warm stone of the wall, and I felt returning from the stone what I can only describe as recognition. The stone had been waiting. The stone did not know that. The stone knew nothing. But I felt it that way, and I think a woman is allowed in the moment when the world stops falling to feel it the way she feels it. I sat down on the dry cave floor with my back against the warm wall, and I sat there for a long time in the lantern light, and I thought about Robert, about the summer afternoons he had spent on this hillside, when I thought he was engaged in the beautiful, useless work of a man who loved knowledge for its own sake, about the quiet efficiency with which he had made his map, about the sentence he had chosen to write beside his notation, the sentence of a Cornish miner who had learned in a tin mine in England what stone remembers and what it offers to those who are willing to go deep enough to find it. He had known. He had surveyed this hillside with the attention he gave to everything, and he had found this, and he had made his map, and he had put it in a Bible between Lamentations and Ezekiel, where I would find it when I needed it. Which is the most precise form of love? I know. Not the love that promises to stay, the love that prepares for its own absence. I got up from the cave floor eventually. I picked up the lantern and I went back through the passage and through the gap in the fall, and across the outer chamber to where Ida lay in our makeshift bed, with Cinder pressed against her, and her eyes open in the dark, watching the lantern light come toward her across the uneven floor. She looked at me for a long moment. She read my face the way a mother reads a face she has been reading for 63 years. I sat down beside her. I took her cold hands in mine, and I said the only thing that needed saying, the thing that was true and sufficient, and asked nothing of her except that she be ready to keep going. Robert knew, I said. Her hands tightened around mine. She closed her eyes. After a moment, she nodded once slowly, the way she nodded when something confirmed what she had already suspected. Outside, the wind moved through the scrub pine on the hillside with a sound like water, and the frost tightened its grip on the ground, and the peaks above Greystone disappeared into the coming winter. Inside the cave in the outer dark, Cinder lifted his gray head and looked toward the northwest passage with his ears forward, as though he could hear even from here the slow, warm breath of the earth moving steadily upward through the ancient stone. The first thing Nora built was a wall. Not a grand thing. Not the kind of wall a man with timber and proper tools and a crew of helpers might construct in a day. It was a low wall of flat limestone pieces, selected from the rubble of the cave floor, each one chosen for its flatness and its weight, fitted together without mortar at first, in the way that dry stone had been fitted together by people who needed walls and had only stone to make them. Which is to say, by everyone everywhere since the beginning of the human habit of trying to hold warmth in a single place. She had watched Robert do something similar once on a survey trip to the hill country south of Harrisburg, where an old farmstead had been abandoned, and its stone walls remained outlasting the family that built them by 40 years. He had run his hands along the top course and explained to her the principle of it, the way each stone locked the ones beside it, the way the weight of the upper courses pressed the lower ones into stability, the way a wall built this way could stand for a century without a single drop of mortar if the stones were chosen correctly. She had listened the way she listened to everything Robert told her about the earth and its materials, not as a student receiving instruction, but as a partner storing information that might someday be useful. She had not imagined, standing in a Pennsylvania field in 1879, that the someday would look like this. But the information was there, solid and retrievable, and she used it. The wall went up between the northwest passage entrance and the main outer chamber. It was not meant to be permanent. It was meant to be functional, to create a separation between the living space she was making in the warm inner chamber and the cold storage space she intended to make of the outer cave. The wall did not need to be beautiful. It needed to hold. She worked at it for 4 days, carrying stones from the outer chamber floor, selecting and rejecting, fitting and refitting. Her hands were raw by the second day, the fingertips split at the creases from the cold and the work, and she wrapped them each evening in strips of cloth torn from a worn petticoat, and unwrapped them each morning and went back to it. Ida sat in the inner chamber near the geothermal fissure with Cinder beside her, and the improvement in Ida's breathing in the warmth of that space was so immediate and so marked that it operated on Nora as a more effective motivator than any act of will could have been. By the fourth day, the wall stood waist-high and solid, and Nora had discovered in the building of it something she had not expected, which was that the work itself had a quality she could only describe as clarifying. Each stone placed correctly was a small proof. Each course completed was a form of argument, an assertion made not in words but in weight and friction, and the patient logic of material things. The cave was cold and dark, and the situation was dire, and the wall did not change any of that, but the wall was real and it was hers, and she had built it from nothing but what the cave provided, and what Robert had taught her, and that was enough to keep her hands moving. She found the vertical shaft on the fifth day. She had been studying the ceiling of the inner chamber for several days, noting the way the lantern smoke moved when she held it in different positions, tracking the slight currents of air that even a sealed cave produces from the differential pressure of its various passages and chambers. The smoke moved consistently toward the northeast corner of the chamber, rising in a slow spiral that told her there was something above drawing it upward. She built a small platform from the crates she had salvaged, stacking them carefully, and climbed until she could reach the ceiling with her hands. The shaft was there, narrow and irregular, rising vertically into the limestone above. She could not see the top of it, but when she held her palm over the opening, she felt the draft, faint but steady, moving upward and out. A chimney, not a human-made one, a geological one, a natural feature of the limestone that had been drawing air upward through this chamber for longer than anyone could calculate. She spent 2 hours carefully clearing the debris from its lower opening, removing small rocks and the accumulated sediment of decades, until the draft strengthened to something she could feel on her face. She built the first controlled fire that evening. It was a small fire, carefully contained, built in a shallow depression. She had dug in the chamber floor directly below the shaft. She used dry wood sparingly, the kind of fire a person builds when they are measuring what they have against what they need, and finding the margin narrow. The smoke rose from it in a thin column, found the shaft, and disappeared upward into the limestone above. The chamber filled not with smoke, but with warmth, a steady, accumulating warmth that was different in quality from the geothermal warmth of the fissure, more immediate, more responsive, the warmth of combustion layering over the ancient warmth of the earth beneath. Ida held her hands out toward the small fire and did not speak for a long time. Then she said that it reminded her of the kitchen in the house where she had grown up, in the way that warmth in the right place after a long cold made everything that had come before feel, if not worth it, then at least survivable. Nora added the word survivable to her private accounting of useful things. The knotwork of the days that followed had a quality she had not anticipated, a rhythm that was not comfortable exactly, but that was purposeful in a way that comfort rarely is. She organized the outer chamber into a storage system, arranging the salvage crates along the walls and filling them with the provisions she had brought. The potatoes and onions and carrots went in the deepest section of the outer cave, where the temperature was consistently cold, but never dropped below freezing, the natural refrigeration of the limestone, maintaining its own reliable arithmetic regardless of what the weather did outside. She cataloged everything. She kept a notebook of quantities, dates, rates of consumption, projected durations. Robert's habit of meticulous observation had transferred itself to her, or perhaps she had always had it, and had simply had less occasion to use it before now. The notebook became a record of their survival, a document that tracked the distance between what they had and what they needed, with the same precision Robert had applied to tracking the distance between the surface and the underlying geology. The ventilation system she refined over the course of a week, adjusting the placement of the fire, experimenting with the size and composition of the fuel to minimize smoke production. She discovered that certain combinations of hardwood and pine burned cleanest, and she noted this in the notebook alongside the other observations. She discovered that the chamber temperature, with the fire burning for 2 hours in the morning and 2 in the evening, stabilized at a level that was not warm in any luxurious sense, but that was compatible with sustained life and work, which was all she was asking of it. She was asking a great deal of it. The idea for the garden came from a memory. She had been sitting in the inner chamber one evening reading by lantern light from one of Robert's geology texts when she came across a passage describing the cave systems of southern France and the various uses to which they had been put by the people who found them over the centuries. Among these uses was the cultivation of mushrooms in the absolute dark of the deeper passages, a practice that the text noted had been carried on for so long that its origins were not precisely documented. She set the book down and looked at the crate nearest to her, which contained the last of the oat sacks, and she thought about the fissure and its warmth and the filtered light that reached the inner chamber for 4 hours each day through a high crevice in the limestone that she had noticed, but not yet fully examined. The next morning she examined it carefully, standing on her stacked crates and measuring with her hand the angle and duration of the light that entered through the crevice. It was not strong light. In any ordinary agricultural context, it would have been laughably insufficient. But she was not operating in an ordinary agricultural context, and she had learned in the weeks since entering this cave to take with complete seriousness the things that were available to her, and to stop measuring them against what was not. She spent 3 days hauling soil. It was the hardest physical work she had done since entering the cave, harder than building the wall, harder than clearing the shaft. She went out each morning before full light, taking cinder with her, and she carried soil from a sheltered hollow on the hillside, where the ground had not frozen as deeply as elsewhere. Filling a bucket she had fashioned from one of the salvaged tin pails, and carrying it back to the cave in both hands. 8 trips each day. The frozen ground resisted the improvised spade she had made from a flat piece of shale lashed to a branch with leather strips, and her shoulders ached from the angle of it. And twice she slipped on the icy hillside and went down on one knee, and had to stop and assess the damage before continuing. But the soil accumulated. She filled 4 shallow crates with it, placing them along the wall nearest to the geothermal fissure and closest to the angle of the crevice light. She had saved seeds the previous summer. Without entirely knowing why, the old habit of a woman who had kept a kitchen garden for 20 years and could not quite bring herself to stop wrapping them in cloth and storing them in a small tin box. Basil and parsley and chives and the hardy leaf lettuce that she had always found most reliable in difficult conditions. She planted them on a morning in the 2nd week of December, pressing each seed into the soil with her fingertip, working methodically across each crate from left to right. It felt, she would think later, like a form of argument, like a statement made not to any person in particular, but to the general situation, to the cold and the dark and the narrowness of their margin. A declaration that she intended something beyond bare survival. 10 days passed. She checked the crates each morning with the same careful attention. She applied to everything, holding the lantern low and looking for movement, for any change in the surface of the soil. Nothing. The soil sat dark and inert in the crates, unchanged from the day she had planted, and she noted in the notebook that 10 days had passed without germination, and assessed the possible causes. Insufficient warmth, insufficient light, poor soil quality, seed viability compromised by the conditions of the previous summer. She moved the crates, This was not a small undertaking. She had placed them with care, believing she had found the optimal position, and moving them meant reassessing everything she had thought. She understood about the distribution of warmth and light in the chamber. She spent a full day in observation, before moving anything sitting in the chamber at different hours, and tracking the way the light changed, holding her hand at different heights and distances from the fissure to map the warmth gradient. Then she moved the crates 18 inches to the left and angled them slightly toward the crevice, and she waited. The first leaf appeared on the 14th day of January. It was a parsley seedling, pale and tentative, pushing up through the dark soil with the particular determination of a living thing that has decided to be alive, regardless of what the surrounding conditions have to say about it. Nora saw it in the morning lantern check and stood for a moment looking at it without speaking. Then she called Ida. Ida came from the sleeping area, slowly, her hand on the wall for balance, and she stood beside Nora and looked into the crate at the small pale seedling. She reached in and touched it with the tip of one arthritic finger, very gently, the way you touch something you are not certain is real. Then the basil came, and the chives, and finally the lettuce spreading across the surface of the second crate in a low green wave that was so improbable in the context of December, in a limestone cave that, looking at it, produced a quality of feeling that Nora could not precisely name. She harvested the first parsley leaf 3 weeks later. She had been waiting for the plant to establish itself fully, resisting the impulse to take anything before the root system was strong enough to sustain the loss. When she judged the moment right, she pinched the leaf between her finger and thumb and held it in her palm and carried it to where Ida was sitting near the fire. Ida took the leaf. She held it under her nose and closed her eyes and inhaled slowly. Her arthritic fingers turned it once. She crushed it gently between thumb and forefinger and brought her fingers to her lips, and her eyes were still closed when a single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness. Nora knew the difference by now, having watched her mother's face in every kind of weather for 63 years. It was the tear of a woman who has been living at the outer edge of what is endurable and has just been shown by a single crushed parsley leaf in a limestone cave in December that the edge is not the end. They were not merely surviving. They were growing. It was on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of February that Corwin appeared. Nora heard nothing before she saw him. No footsteps, no displaced stone, no change in Cinder's breathing to indicate he had detected an approach. One moment she was alone at the cave entrance, splitting the hardwood pieces she had collected into sizes that would fit the fire without choking the shaft. And the next moment there was a man standing 20 feet away in the scrub pine, with his hands open at his sides. He was old. Older than she had initially assessed. She revised upward to somewhere past 70 when she saw him more clearly. He was thin in the way of men who have spent many decades outdoors, the thin of muscle and tendon and bone that has shed every excess as surplus weight the land will not support. His clothes were serviceable and worn, and patched in multiple places with different materials. The patches themselves patched in some cases, which told her a great deal about both his circumstances and his attitude toward them. He held a brace of rabbits in his left hand. His right hand was open and visible. Cinder came around from behind her and stood at her side and made a sound in his chest that was more consideration than warning, a sound that meant he was gathering information rather than issuing a verdict. This told her something too. She looked at the man. He looked at her. The rabbits hung from his left hand. She was aware of the axe handle in her own right hand, the wood she had been splitting. She did not set it down. She also did not raise it. He set the rabbits on the ground between them. Then he stepped back 2 paces and waited. She understood then from this pantomime of intent that he had been watching the cave for some days, that he had noted the smoke or the lack of it, and the patterns of her movement the evidence she left on the hillside of her work, and her methods, that he had arrived at some conclusions about what she was doing, and had decided for reasons of his own to make this gesture. She stepped forward and picked up the rabbits. She looked at him for a moment. Then she gestured with her head toward the cave entrance. He followed her as far as the outer chamber. He moved through it without speaking, his eyes taking in the organized shelves, the system of storage, the low wall she had built between the outer and inner spaces. His assessment was thorough and unhurried. The assessment of a man who reads a place the way Robert had read a geological formation, looking for what it tells him about the mind that made it. She led him no further. She took the rabbits to the inner chamber and returned to find him standing where she had left him, examining the wall with his hands. He ran his fingers along the top course, the way Robert had run his fingers along the abandoned farmstead wall in Pennsylvania, feeling for the logic of the fitting. She watched him do this. She did not speak. He came back twice in the following week, each time in the afternoon, each time with something. A packet of salt wrapped in oilcloth, a small bundle of dried bark that she did not immediately recognize. He left these at the cave entrance without coming inside, and he did not stay. On his third visit, Ida's cough was bad, a day when the outer temperature had dropped sharply, and even the inner chamber had responded with a degree of chill that the fire had not entirely compensated for. The coughing was the deep rattling kind that came from the bottom of her lungs and left her exhausted and pale. Nora had come to the cave entrance for air, standing just outside in the thin winter light, with her eyes closed and her face turned up, and she heard him approach and opened her eyes. He held out the bundle of bark. He said that it needed to be simmered in water for 20 minutes, not boiled, and that the tea should be taken hot 3 times a day. He said a woman he had known 30 years ago had learned it from her grandmother, who had learned it from her grandmother before that, and that it was old knowledge, older than anyone could say exactly, but that it worked. She took the bark. She made the tea exactly as he described. She gave it to Ida 3 times that day and 3 times the next. By the 3rd day, the cough had changed. Not gone, not entirely, but lighter, less violent. The deep rattling quality reduced to something that sounded less like something breaking and more like something mending. She went to the cave entrance the following afternoon and waited. When he appeared, she looked at him steadily for a moment. Then she said that the tea had helped and that she was grateful for the knowledge of it. He nodded once. He looked past her at the cave entrance with the same unhurried assessment he had given everything else. Then he looked back at her and said, with the economy of a man who rations his words with the same care she rationed her provisions, that she had built something here that was worth building. He came on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks later, and she was in the inner chamber, checking the garden crates when she heard Cinder make the particular sound that meant a known visitor. She came out to find him standing at the low wall she had built, looking into the inner chamber. She let him in. He stood at the edge of the growing crates and looked at what she had made there. The pale green of the parsley and chives, the broader leaves of the lettuce catching the crevice light, the smell of basil that was the smell of a summer garden, transposed to the inside of the earth, incongruous and real and fragrant in the enclosed stone space. He reached out and touched a parsley leaf with the tip of one finger. He held it for a moment. Then he looked at her, and in his face she saw the thing she had seen almost nowhere since entering this cave, which was recognition, not surprise, not suspicion, not the particular quality of male assessment that measures a woman's work against a standard it did not set and finds it either impressive for what she is or deficient by what she is not. Just recognition. The look of one person seeing another person's work and understanding it. Miners do this, he said. Deep shafts. I have heard of it. He paused. I never knew a woman who worked it out alone." Then he stepped back from the crates and moved toward the cave entrance and left, as he always left, without ceremony or prolonged farewell. She stood in the inner chamber for a moment after he had gone, in the warmth of the geothermal fissure and the smell of the growing things, and she thought that this was the first time in a very long while that she had felt not validated. Validation was too thin a thing for what she felt, but seen. Simply, accurately, sufficiently seen. It was Corwin who carried the news to town, though he had not intended to and would not have done it deliberately. He went to Greystone in the third week of February to trade winter furs for salt and coffee transactions he conducted with Mr. Gable at the general store, with the minimum of conversation that their long acquaintance had established as standard. Gable saw the small bunch of parsley Corwin had in his coat pocket, herbs she had pressed on him when he left, and asked where it had come from, in the flat, direct way of a man who keeps inventory of everything that passes through his county. "From the woman in the rock," Corwin said. He offered nothing further because he had nothing further to offer that was Gable's business, and he completed his transactions and left. The parsley sat on Gable's counter for 3 days. People looked at it. People asked about it. The story of what Corwin had said passed from person to person with the particular velocity of information in a small town that has very little of it, and it changed in the passing, as all such stories do, accumulating the distortions of each teller's particular anxieties and preoccupations, until what arrived at Reverend Hatch's door bore only a structural resemblance to what Gable had heard. Hatch preached on it the following Sunday. He was a man who had built his authority on the principle that the world was legible, that its rules were fixed, and that his role was to articulate and enforce them. And a woman growing green things in the dark of a condemned hillside cave, in the middle of a November winter, violated enough of those rules simultaneously that it required direct address. He spoke of unnatural harvests. He spoke of things grown in darkness. He did not name her. He did not need to. The congregation of Greystone knew exactly who he was talking about, and they left the church that Sunday divided in the way of people who have been given explicit permission to be afraid into those who were afraid, and those who were afraid of something else entirely, which was hunger. The distinction had been growing quietly for weeks. The supply train from the east had been delayed twice in January by ice on the high passes. Gable's shelves were thinner than they should have been for midwinter. The price of flour had gone up twice in 6 weeks, a thing Greystone had not seen before, and the households that had not put up sufficient stores in the autumn, which was most of them, were beginning to feel in their daily arithmetic the particular anxiety of a winter that was not cooperating with their plans. It was the blacksmith's wife who came first. She arrived at the cave entrance in the late afternoon when the winter light was already going thin and gray, and she stood at the outer edge of the scrub pine for a moment before Cinder noticed her and Nora came to the entrance and saw her there. Her youngest child had been sick with the chest cough for 2 weeks, and the laudanum from Gable's had done nothing, and she was out of options, and she had run out of the particular pride that keeps people from crossing the lines. They have decided not to cross. She did not apologize for coming. She did not explain herself beyond what was necessary. She stated the fact of her child's illness with the directness of a woman who has set aside everything that is not essential. Nora brought her inside. She sat the woman by the small fire, and she made the bark tea the way Corwin had shown her, simmering it for 20 minutes and pouring it into a tin cup and adding a little of the dried parsley for the warmth of it. She wrapped a stone from the inner chamber wall, a piece of limestone that had sat within 3 feet of the geothermal fissure for the past 2 months, and held its warmth reliably for 4 or 5 hours in a piece of heavy wool cloth, and gave it to the woman to take home and put against the child's chest. She sent her with a small bunch of the parsley and thyme, and a cup of dried beans besides, because the woman's face when she sat by the fire had told her things that the woman had not said, about how thin the winter had become in the house behind the smithy. The woman said nothing when she left. She gathered what Nora had given her, and she left without meeting Nora's eyes, and Nora did not require her to. 3 days later, the blacksmith came to the cave entrance. He was a large man, and he came without his wife, and he stood at the entrance for a moment with an expression that was working through several things at once. Then he set down what he had carried, a heavy cast-iron cooking grate and a sharpened axe head, and he looked at Nora for a moment with an expression that had resolved itself into something simple and clear. He nodded once. He turned and walked back down the hillside without speaking. After that, they came one at a time, or sometimes two together. Families from the edge of the town's confidence who had decided that whatever Reverend Hatch said about unnatural harvests was less relevant than the fact of their children's faces. They came with their pride worn down to something manageable, and they came with whatever they had to trade jars of preserves and sacks of flour, and days of labor chopping the hardwood she needed. And they left with potatoes and onions and herbs, and the warmth of having spent an hour near a fire that did not burn furniture to make itself. They did not come for Nora. She understood this and did not require it to be otherwise. They came for what she had, which was abundance in a season of scarcity, and they left with it. And as they left, she watched their faces perform a calculation that she recognized the calculation of a person revising an estimate they had been confident in. She did not help them with the revision. She simply gave them what they had come for and let the revision happen at whatever pace it was going to happen, which is the only way any revision of that kind ever actually occurs. The sky changed on a morning in late February. She noticed it first by the quality of the light through the high crevice. A light that was flat and diffuse rather than directional. The kind of light that means the sky above has become a single unified thing, rather than a field of differentiated weather. She went to the cave entrance and stood looking out at the horizon to the northwest. The clouds there were the color of a bruise, that particular shade between gray and purple, that she had seen once before in her life, on an afternoon in Ohio, when she was 12 years old, an hour before a storm, that her mother had said afterward she had never seen the equal of. She stood at the cave entrance for a long time, watching the color spread across the sky. Cinder came and sat beside her, pressing his warm flank against her leg, and she put her hand on his head without looking down. The wind was coming from the northwest now, down from the peaks, and it carried in it a smell that was different from ordinary winter cold. A smell with weight and volume to it. A smell that was the smell of water in enormous quantity, suspended and waiting and about to become something else. She thought about the town behind her. The church with its wooden pews, the general store with its thinning shelves, the houses with their wood piles, each one she had walked past in the years she lived there, and assessed without intending to, the way a woman who has paid careful attention to the world cannot help assessing the things around her. She stood at the cave entrance with the northwest wind in her face, and she felt the winter settle into its intention. And she thought that whatever was coming down from those peaks was going to be the test of everything, of the wall she had built, and the garden she had grown, and the stores she had laid down with such careful arithmetic, of the warmth in the rock below her, and the chimney that drew the smoke upward, and the knowledge that Robert had given her, and Trevithick had given Robert, and someone before Trevithick had given Trevithick, passed hand to hand across the decades like a lamp carried through a dark passage. She went back inside. She had preparations to make. The snow began on a Wednesday. Nora knew it was Wednesday because she had kept careful count of the days since entering the cave, marking each one in the back of her notebook with a small vertical line, the way prisoners mark time, the way anyone marks time when the ordinary signposts of a week have been replaced by the undifferentiated rhythm of survival. Wednesday, the 20th of February, 1888. And the snow that began that morning was not the snow she had known before. She had known hard winters. She had grown up in a part of the country where winter was not a season so much as a condition, a state of being that the landscape entered in November and did not leave until it was ready, which was sometimes March and sometimes April, and once in the winter of her 14th year, not until the first week of May. She knew what serious cold looked like and felt like and smelled like, and she knew the difference between a winter that intended to test you and a winter that intended to break you. This one intended to break things. The snow came horizontally in the first hours, driven by a northwest wind that had lost none of its force in the long passage down from the peaks. It did not fall so much as arrive moving through the air with the purposeful velocity of something that had a destination and intended to reach it. Within 4 hours of the first flake, the cave entrance was partially obscured. The scrub pine outside bent to angles. Their trunks had not been asked to hold before, and the creek below the hillside, which Nora had been able to hear every morning since they arrived, went silent under the weight of accumulation. She went to the entrance twice in the first day to clear the snow that was building against the lower lip of the cave mouth, pushing it back with the flat shale spade she had used to dig the garden soil. The wind took her breath each time she stepped outside, pressing against her chest with a physical insistence, and the cold of it was a different order of cold from anything the cave had produced. A cold with intention behind it. A cold that was looking for the place where the warmth was thinnest and pressing there. She did not go out a third time. Inside the cave performed exactly as she had built it to perform. The geothermal fissure breathed its slow, warm current upward through the limestone, with the same steady reliability it had maintained since the first morning. She pressed her palms against the warm stone and understood what Robert had left her. The fire in the chimney shaft burned its careful 2-hour morning and 2-hour evening cycle, the smoke drawn efficiently upward and out, the chamber temperature holding at the level she had established over weeks of patient calibration. The wall she had built between the outer and inner chambers did its work, trapping the warmth on the living side and leaving the cold storage side cold enough for the provisions without being cold enough to freeze them. The garden grew. This was the thing that struck her most forcefully in those first days of the storm. Not the howling of the wind at the cave mouth, not the darkness that deepened as the snow accumulated and reduced the light through the high crevice, but the fact that the parsley and chives and lettuce in their shallow crates continued their quiet, indifferent growth, regardless of what the weather was doing outside. They did not know there was a storm. They knew only the warmth of the fissure and the light of the crevice and the water she gave them from the creek supply she had stored in the weeks before allowing it to reach cave temperature, before she applied it to the roots. They grew as they had been growing, at their own pace, on their own terms, subject to none of the drama occurring 40 feet away at the cave mouth. She found this steadying in a way she had not anticipated. Ida was better in the storm than she had been in the weeks before it. The consistency of the inner chamber temperature, which did not fluctuate with the outdoor weather, the way even a well-built house fluctuated, agreed with her lungs in a manner that the rented room at Mrs. Pruitt's never had. She slept more soundly. The morning cough, which had been the first sound of every day since October, became in the storm a later and lighter thing, as though her body, recognizing that the environment had stabilized, had relaxed. Some vigilance it had been maintaining out of necessity. Nora watched this and noted it in her notebook alongside the temperature observations and the garden records and the inventory counts. She noted everything because she had learned from Robert that what is not recorded is subject to the distortions of memory and wishful thinking, and she could not afford distortions of any kind. On the second day of the storm, she took full inventory. She went through every crate and sack and tin in the outer chamber by lantern light, counting and weighing and recording. What she found confirmed what her careful rationing had been working towards since November. They had enough. Not abundance, not the kind of plenty that allows for generosity without calculation, but enough which, in the arithmetic of a cave in a blizzard, was a different word from what it meant in any other context. It meant they would not run out. It meant the mathematics of their survival, which she had been solving one day at a time since November, had a solution. She sat with the notebook in her lap and looked at the columns of figures and felt something she did not immediately have a name for. It was not relief, or not only relief. It was the specific satisfaction of a proof completed, of a calculation carried through all its steps to its conclusion without error. She had done this. The number of mouths had been 2 plus a dog. The number of days had been uncertain. She had built her margin wide enough that the uncertainty had not mattered, and now she knew it had not mattered, and the knowing of it was its own particular form of warmth. The storm continued on the 3rd day and the 4th. She lost track of time in a different way during the storm. The ordinary markers of the day compressed and altered by the continuous darkness outside and the unchanging quality of the light within. She slept when she was tired and woke when she was rested, and ate at intervals determined by hunger, rather than by the clock she no longer had access to. She tended the garden and fed the fire, and read to Ida from Robert's geology texts in the evenings, the ones with descriptive passages about the physical world that Ida found interesting, and the ones with technical specifications that she found less so, but that Nora read anyway for her own purposes. She was reading the section on geothermal gradients in the limestone belts of the mid-Atlantic region, a section she had read before, but that took on new dimensions of meaning when read within a geothermal feature, rather than in a rented room when she heard Cinder lift his head from the cave floor and make the sound that meant a known quantity approaching, not the considering sound he made for Corwin. Something more alert than that. Something he was not sure about. She put the book down and went to the outer chamber. Silas Webb was standing at the cave entrance. She recognized him before she recognized the specifics of his appearance. The broad outline of him, the particular set of his shoulders. It took her a moment longer to process the rest of it. The burlap sacking wrapped around his boots and lower legs. The ice in his beard and eyebrows. The way he was holding his arms slightly away from his body in the involuntary posture of a man who has been cold for a very long time and can no longer entirely control his extremities. He had walked 2 miles from Greystone through the storm. She understood this without being told. The creek bed, she thought, frozen solid, the only landmark still readable. It would have taken him most of a day. Cinder stood beside her, and the sound in his chest was not quite a growl, and not quite silence. She put her hand on the back of his neck and felt him hold the sound where it was present, but contained. She looked at Webb. He was diminished. This was the only word she had for what she was seeing, the only word that fit the precision she required of herself in observing things. He was not the man who had sat behind his desk in the land office in November and pushed a deed across the polished wood with a finger that tapped once and words that were precisely spaced and perfectly weighted. That man had occupied his chair with the settled authority of someone who has never had occasion to doubt that the world will continue to arrange itself around his needs. The man standing at the cave entrance was not that man. He was smaller in some way that had nothing to do with his physical dimensions. He looked past her at the outer chamber. She watched his eyes move over the shelves, the organized crates, the evidence of her system. She watched him process what he was seeing against what he had expected to see, which she suspected was 2 frozen bodies and a dead dog, and the confirmation of everything he had believed about what happened to women who refused the arrangements that were offered to them. His eyes came back to her face. He did not speak immediately. He was a man who had built his professional identity on the precise deployment of words, and the situation had removed from him the words that his professional identity relied upon, and he had not yet found the ones that fit what was left. She waited. "The town's reserves are gone," he said finally. His voice was not what it had been in the land office. The cold had taken something from it. Or perhaps it was not the cold. "The church is full of families. We are burning the furniture. There are children." He said this last sentence separately with a pause before it, in the way of a man using the one argument he believes cannot be refused, which told her that he understood at some level that the other arguments had already been refused, and that he was correct in this understanding. She looked at him for a moment. She was aware of the quality of the silence between them, the weight of everything that had been said in the land office in November, and everything that had been not said in the months since the $10 in the deed, and his precisely weighted words about her husband's memory. And she was aware that she could fill this silence with any of that, could make him stand in the cold, and here it could make him know that she remembered every word. She had no interest in doing that. She asked him one question. How many children, he told her. She did the arithmetic quickly and revised her inventory assessment against the new variables. Then she turned and went into the inner chamber and began to prepare. She worked through what remained of that day and into the evening. She reorganized the outer chamber, clearing the central space of the stored crates and moving them to the walls to create room along the floor. She brought armloads of the sphagnum moss bedding from the inner chamber, laying it down in rows along the cleared floor space. She stoked the fire in the inner chamber and regulated it carefully, calculating how long the warmth would take to permeate the outer chamber to a temperature compatible with prolonged human occupancy. She calculated what she could distribute from her stores without compromising their own survival through the remainder of the winter and the early spring. She set aside what was needed and organized the rest into portions, each one measured against the number of people and the number of days she was planning for. She had not been asked to plan for any specific number of days. She planned for 7 because 7 was the number her inventory supported, and because 7 was, she judged, the probable duration of the storm based on the cloud formation she had observed and the behavior of the wind. Robert had taught her to read weather in the same way he had taught her to read rock, by attending to what was there rather than to what was expected, and what had been there in the sky 2 days before the storm arrived had said 7 days to anyone who knew how to listen. She sent Cinder to find Corwin. She was not certain this would work. She had seen Cinder track Corwin's scent on the hillside on several occasions when the old man had come and gone, and she had seen how precisely the dog understood the geography of his routes. But sending a dog deliberately to locate a specific person was a different undertaking. She stood at the cave entrance and pointed in the direction of Corwin's cabin, and spoke to Cinder in the deliberate, clear voice she used when she needed him to understand that this was not a general instruction, but a specific one. And she told him to find Corwin and to bring him back. Cinder looked at her for a moment with the gray-eyed steadiness of a dog who has been paying close attention to a human for 11 years and has learned to distinguish between the kinds of things she says. Then he went out into the storm. She went back inside and continued working. Corwin arrived 2 hours later with Cinder at his side and snow in every fold of his clothing. He took in the preparations she had made with his characteristic economy of expression, looking at each change in the cave's arrangement, without commenting on it, processing what it told him about what she intended. Then he nodded once and took off his coat and went to work beside her, without being told what was needed. They worked well together, she and Corwin, in the way of two people who have established through repeated contact that they share certain fundamental assumptions about how work should be done. No wasted motion, no unnecessary speech. each one reading what the other was doing and fitting their own actions to the space that was left. She had worked this way with Robert, and before Robert with her mother, and she had not known until now how much she had missed it. The procession from Greystone arrived in the late afternoon. She saw the lanterns first moving through the trees below the hillside, a scattered cluster of lights that resolved as they came closer into individual figures, families moving together through the accumulated snow, with the cautious deliberateness of people who are cold and exhausted, and not certain of their welcome. Webb was in front. He had made the return journey to town and organized this and led them back, which was something she noted without assigning it more weight than it deserved. He had done what the situation required. So had she. She and Corwin stood at the cave entrance with their own lanterns and guided them in. They came silently for the most part. The children were quietest of all, which was not the natural state of children, and told her what she needed to know about how the past 4 days had been in the church with the furniture burning. She counted them as they passed her, checking her numbers against Webb's, and when the last family was inside, she followed them in and took stock of what she had. She had the outer chamber cleared and laid with moss, bedding the geothermal warmth of the inner chamber, seeping through the wall she had built at a rate that was not luxurious, but was sufficient. She had the fire in the inner chamber chimney shaft, which she now stoked to its maximum safe output. Calculating the draft capacity of the geological chimney against the smoke production of the fuel, and the number of lungs now occupying the connected spaces, she had her stores portioned and organized. She had Corwin, who moved through the families with the quiet competence of a man who has spent 50 years solving practical problems in difficult country. She had Ida. This was not a thing she had planned for as a resource, but Ida, in the warmth of the inner chamber over the past months, had become something that Nora had not entirely registered in the dailiness of their life together. She had become herself, not the diminished, careful version of herself that cold and uncertainty produced, but the person she actually was, which was a woman of considerable force and humor, and the specific authority that comes from having endured a great many things without being broken by any of them. Ida moved through the families in the outer chamber with a tin cup of warm broth in each hand, and the expression of a woman who has been waiting for something useful to do. She knew half of these people from her years in Greystone, and she spoke to them in the direct, unornamented way she spoke to everyone asking after their children and their stores and their woodpiles, with the practical specificity of a person who understands that what people need when they are frightened is not reassurance but information, and that genuine attention is the only currency that purchases actual comfort. Nora distributed the food in the portions she had calculated. The venison stew she had prepared, thick with potatoes and onions and the parsley and thyme from the garden, went first to the children and then to the adults. She gave each child a cup of the thyme and bark tea that Corwin had taught her, warm and slightly sweet from the dried apple she had added, and she watched them drink it with the attentiveness she had applied to every medical observation since Ida's cough first changed. No one spoke much in those first hours. They ate and they looked around at the cave that Nora had made habitable, and they felt the warmth of the geothermal fissure conducting through the limestone wall, and they sat with the particular silence of people who are revising something large. Webb sat apart from the others near the wall of the outer chamber, his back against the stone. He had refused the soup twice before accepting it on the third offer, which Ida had made without ceremony, and without acknowledgement of the previous refusals, simply appearing with the cup and setting it in his hands and moving on. He ate it looking at the floor. She watched him without appearing to watch him. She had been doing this her whole life, the specifically female skill of observing, without making the observation visible. And she was very good at it. On the second day, the children found the garden. One of the younger ones, a girl of perhaps 5, who had detached herself from her mother with the purposeful independence of small children who have identified something interesting, came through the gap in Nora's wall and stood in the inner chamber looking at the crates of growing things with an expression of complete arrested wonder. She stood very still, her mouth slightly open, looking at the green leaves in the lamplight, with the focused attention of a child, encountering something that her existing categories cannot accommodate. Nora came and stood beside her. She did not explain. She reached into the nearest crate and pinched a small sprig of parsley from the nearest plant and held it out. The girl looked at it. Then she looked at Nora. Then she took the parsley and smelled it very carefully, pulling the smell into herself with the concentrated effort of a child doing something important. She looked back up at Nora and said nothing, but her face said everything that needed to be said about the distance between the past 4 days and this moment. Other children came after that, and adults too, drawn by the reported impossibility of what the girl had described. They stood at the edge of the growing crates and looked at the green living things flourishing in the rock, and they were very quiet, each one processing it privately in whatever terms their individual experience provided. Reverend Hatch stood there longest. He had not spoken to Nora since arriving. He moved through the cave with the careful dignity of a man maintaining a position he knows has been compromised, but has not yet determined how to revise. When he came to the garden and stood looking at it, his face went through several things that she watched with the same careful attention she gave to everything. He stood there for a long time, long enough that the other adults nearby became aware of it and gave him the space that his standing there seemed to require. Then he looked at the ceiling of the inner chamber, at the limestone above the garden where the faint, filtered light came through the crevice, and something in his face settled into a different configuration from any she had seen there before. He did not speak to her. He turned and walked back to the outer chamber. But the sermon he gave on the Sunday after the families returned to Greystone, which she heard about from 3 separate sources over the following weeks, did not contain the word unnatural. It contained, by all accounts, a lengthy passage about the ways in which wisdom presents itself in forms that the ordinary eye fails to recognize, and a somewhat extended reflection on the women of Scripture who had preserved life in impossible circumstances, and a concluding observation that the Lord worked through the knowledge he saw fit to distribute, and that it was not given to man to determine in advance what form that knowledge would take, or in whose hands it would be placed. She thought Robert would have found this very funny. She found it sufficient. The 5th day dawned clear. She went to the cave entrance in the early morning and stood looking out at the world that the storm had made. The snow had drifted against the hillside in formations of considerable sculptural ambition, shapes that had no precedent in ordinary winter, and that caught the early light in ways that were, whatever else they were, undeniably beautiful. The sky above was the specific blue that follows a major storm, a blue so clear and cold it seemed to have been scrubbed clean of everything that usually lived in it. The temperature had dropped further in the clearing, as it always did, the storm's own warmth gone with the clouds that had carried it. But the light was back, and the light meant that the families could travel. She organized the return systematically, as she organized everything. She prepared packets of food for each family, calculating what each household would need to sustain itself until the supply train could get through, which she estimated at 10 days. Given the depth of the snow she could see on the hillside. Potatoes and beans and the dried meat she had remaining measured out with her usual precision. For each family with young children, she included a bundle of the dried herbs and a written description of the bark tea written in her own hand on pages torn from the back of her notebook. She was wrapping the last of the packets when she heard Webb approach across the outer chamber floor. She continued what she was doing. She did not look up immediately. She heard him stop a few feet from her, and she finished the wrapping and set the packet with the others before she turned. He was holding something in both hands, a small book, its cover warped with damp, the leather darkened in the way of things that have been kept in conditions not ideal for their preservation. He held it in both hands with a care that was not habitual to him. A man whose relationship to objects was generally the relationship of a man who assigns them value rather than recognizing it. She looked at the book. She recognized the dimensions of it before she recognized anything else. The specific proportions of the thing, and then she recognized the color of the leather. Faded now and warped. But originally the particular dark brown that she had watched Robert select in a stationer's shop in Philadelphia in 1869, running his hand along a row of blank journals with the focused attention he brought to every choice. It was Robert's first field journal, the one he had filled in the summer of 1868, the summer he worked with Trevithick in Cumberland County, the one that contained his earliest observations of the limestone country north of Greystone, and his first attempts to articulate what he was seeing in the rock and what it might mean. It had been on his desk the week before he died. It had not been there after. She had asked afterward in the way of a woman going through a dead man's possessions and taking careful inventory of what was present and what was absent. She had asked Webb because Webb had been among the men who came to help settle the affairs of the farm in the weeks following the death, the small transactions of a life being administered by others. Webb had said he did not know where the journal had gone. She had believed him because she had needed to believe something at that time, and the alternative required a capacity for deliberate suspicion she had not yet developed. She looked at the journal in his hands. He did not say he was sorry. He did not say he had been wrong. These were not. She understood things that Silas Webb had the architecture for, not yet possibly, not ever, and she did not require them from him. What she required was what he was already doing, which was holding out the journal in both hands and waiting for her to take it. And she understood that this was for a man of his particular construction, the fullest acknowledgement available to him. He said, "This belongs here." She took the journal from his hands. The leather was warmer than she expected from the temperature of the outer chamber, which meant he had been holding it for some time, before bringing it to her long enough that his own warmth had transferred to it. She held it for a moment without opening it. Then she looked at him and she allowed him to see in her face that she understood what he had done and what it had cost him to do it, and that this understanding was as close to forgiveness as she was prepared to come at present, which was for a woman in her position a considerable distance. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned and went back to where the families were gathering for the return journey, and she watched him organize the departure with the efficient authority that was his genuine competence, the thing he actually was good at when he was not using it against the wrong people. She stood holding Robert's journal, and she looked at the cave around her, the outer chamber with its organized shelves, the low walls she had built with her own hands from the stone. The earth provided the inner chamber beyond with its fire and its growing things and the steady warm breath of the fissure that Robert had mapped and Trevithick had described, and the earth had been producing since before any human being had stood on this hillside and thought to ask what it meant. She opened the journal to the first page. Robert's handwriting was there, the small, precise script she had read in 1,000 documents and letters and notebook margins over the course of 26 years, as familiar to her as her own. The date at the top of the first entry was June 14th, 1868. The first line read, "Trevithick showed me today how to listen to the rock." She read the entry through to the end. Then she closed the journal and held it against her chest for a moment, with her eyes closed, and she stood in the warm cave, in the clear light that came through the crevice above the garden. And she was 63 years old, and she was a widow, and she had $10 and a hole in the ground, and she was home. The families left that morning. She and Corwin and Ida watched them go from the cave entrance, the long file of them moving down the hillside through the deep snow. Their lanterns unnecessary in the bright, clear light, but still carried small flames that had survived the storm. Greystone did not call it Devil's Moor anymore after that winter. The name shifted gradually, the way names shift in small communities when the story attached to the old name has been superseded by a different story. Some people called it the Hale Place. Some people called it simply the cave, in the way of referring to a landmark that has become so established it no longer requires elaboration. Nora did not leave. She had not intended to leave, but she understood now in a different way than she had understood it in November that not leaving was a choice, and not merely a necessity. The cave was hers. Not in the way the deed made it hers, though the deed was real and she kept it in the back of Robert's field journal, where she had put it the week they moved in. It was hers in the way that a thing is yours when you have understood it completely and built something in it that would not exist without you. She expanded the garden in the spring, adding a 4th crate and then a 5th, experimenting with different varieties as she acquired seeds through trade and the careful husbandry of what she already grew. She cultivated the mushroom logs that the French cave farmers Robert's text had described, setting them up in the deeper passages where the light never reached and the temperature held exactly as the geothermal gradient required. She built a shelter against the south-facing rock face outside the cave entrance and kept 3 goats in it. The sound of them in the early morning, a consistent, cheerful punctuation to the days. Women came, not all at once, and not as a planned thing. They came the way the blacksmith's wife had come singly, and in the specific extremity of a situation that had removed the available alternatives. A widow from the farming district east of town, whose husband had left debts instead of land. A woman whose husband was alive but absent, in the way of a man whose drinking had made him a particular kind of ghost. 2 sisters whose father's death had left them in a legal situation. The town's arrangements did not know how to resolve. They came for shelter and they found it. And they found with it something that was not exactly instruction, and not exactly companionship, but partook of both. Nora did not teach in the way of a school. She worked and she allowed them to work alongside her. And what passed between them in the working was the knowledge that Robert had given her, and Trevithick had given Robert, and the Cornish miners had accumulated over 2 centuries of learning what the earth held and how to reach it. She taught them to read soil. She taught them to listen to rock. She taught them the difference between the cold that kills and the cold that only threatens to. And she taught them how to build a wall from what the ground provides, and how to grow a living thing in a place that does not look like it can support life, and how to do the arithmetic of survival with enough margin for error that the margin does not run out. Ida lived to see the 5th spring in the cave. She died on a clear April morning in 1893, sitting in the chair she had made Nora build for her the previous summer, positioned in the exact spot in the inner chamber where the crevice light fell at its warmest in the morning hours. She died looking at the garden. The expression on her face was the expression of a woman who has completed something she set out to do and is satisfied with how it came out. Nora buried her on the hillside above the cave, in a spot where the limestone outcrops provided a natural frame, and she marked the place with a flat piece of slate taken from the outer chamber wall and carved with a hammer and chisel over the course of 3 evenings. She had not known before this that she could carve, but she had discovered in the preceding 5 years that the list of things she could not do was considerably shorter than anyone had suggested. So she applied herself to it, and the letters came out clear and readable. And that was what mattered. The decades that followed were not without difficulty. There were winters that tested the cave's systems and required Nora to improvise solutions Robert's map had not anticipated. There were droughts that complicated the water supply and economic downturns that thinned the trade network she had built, and seasons when the women who had come to learn went back to circumstances that she could not prevent and that cost her sleep. She was not protected from loss by what she had built. She was only better equipped to continue after it. She continued for a very long time. In the autumn of her 81st year, she was found one morning by the woman who was then her closest companion, a widow named Frances, who had come to the cave 12 years earlier and stayed seated in her chair in the inner chamber, with Robert's geology text open in her lap, and her hands resting quietly on the pages and the expression on her face of a woman who has arrived somewhere she intended to go. At her feet, the current cinder forth of that name, a gray-muzzled shepherd, of no particular breeding but considerable character, lay with his chin on her boot, in the posture he maintained through every hour she sat in that chair, warm and still and exactly present. The garden grew in the crates behind her. The geothermal fissure breathed its slow, patient warmth upward through the limestone, as it had been breathing since before anyone could remember, and would continue to breathe after everyone now living was gone. The morning light came through the high crevice at its familiar angle and fell across the pages of the open book and across her hands and across the face that had watched this cave through its seasons for more than 30 years. Frances placed the journal, Robert's first journal, back on the shelf where Nora kept it next to her own notebooks. 14 of them now filled with the same small, careful script that documented everything she had observed and built and learned and transmitted. She placed the basket of seeds for next spring's planting on the shelf beside the journals. Then she went to the cave entrance and stood looking out at the hillside and the valley and the town that had become, in the 30 years since the great blizzard, a different kind of place from what it had been. Not because anyone had planned for it to change, but because a woman in a cave on a hillside above it had quietly over 3 decades changed the knowledge available to the people living in it. She had fed nearly 200 people in the winter of 1888. She had taught more than 60 women the fundamental skills of reading and working the land. She had sent her knowledge outward through every pair of hands that had worked beside her, and those hands had carried it further, and those further hands had carried it further still, in the way that all real knowledge travels not through books or proclamations, but through the patient transmission of one person teaching another person in the specific presence of the work itself. Her headstone was a piece of slate from the outer chamber wall, taken from the same section of the wall she had built in her first winter, the wall whose top course still bore the marks of Corwin's hands, where he had run his fingers along it and found its logic sound. The inscription was carved by Frances, who had learned to carve from Nora, who had taught herself in the evenings of her 68th year, because the skill was needed and the material was present, and the only question that had ever interested her was how. It said, "Nora Hale." She kept the fire. The cave is still there. The limestone breathes as it always has, patient and indifferent and warm, holding in its ancient geometry the memory of the water and the heat and the slow pressure of time that made it what it is. The wall Nora built is still standing, the lower courses of it, at least the ones she laid in the first weeks when her hands were clumsy with cold and her margin was thin, and she built anyway because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was not a thing she was prepared to do. The garden is gone. Gardens require tending, and when the tender is gone, the garden returns slowly and without drama to the condition of the earth it was taken from. But in the soil of those crates, in the particular composition of what remains there is still the trace of what was grown, the organic memory of basil and parsley and chive and the hardy winter lettuce that grew in the dark against all reasonable expectation, fed by the warmth of the earth and the attention of a woman who understood that what the world decides is worthless and what is actually worthless are not always the same thing. They are, in fact, almost never the same thing. She knew that before she walked into the land office with her $10 in a leather purse and her dead husband's map folded in a Bible. She knew it the way you know things that have been taught to you by someone who understood them deeply, which is to say, she knew it in her hands and her eyes and her habit of attention before she knew it in any form that could be reduced to words. The words came later. They always come later. The knowledge comes first, passed from hand to hand in the dark, warm and specific and sufficient, from everyone who has ever found the breath of the earth in a cold place and understood what it was offering.